Welcome to my channel. Timeless narrative. By the turn of the 20th century, the moderate political approach that had dominated Indian nationalism was beginning to show cracks. Frustration with the lack of progress, coupled with an increasing sense of urgency for self-rule, led to a dramatic shift in the political climate. This shift birthed the rise of extremism, a force that sought to confront British colonial rule more directly and with greater force than the moderates had done. The moderates, with their cautious strategies of petitions, prayers, and appeals to the British, were increasingly seen as ineffective. They were accused of being too cautious, too willing to work within the confines of colonial rule, and their politics came to be viewed as weak, often likened to mendicancy. The extremists, in contrast, were passionate about achieving Swaraj, self-rule, but differed in their interpretation of what this would look like. For some, like Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Swaraj meant Indian control of the administration, but not necessarily complete severance from Britain. For others, like Bipin Chandra Pal, it meant full autonomy, free from British oversight. Three leaders were at the forefront of this shift toward extremism: Bipin Chandra Pal in Bengal, Bal Gangadhar Tilak in Maharashtra, and Lala Lajpat Rai in Punjab. While extremism was strongest in these regions, it had varying degrees of influence elsewhere. The causes for this rise are multifaceted. Factionalism played a role as political groups splintered and competed for power. In Bengal, rivalries between newspaper groups and within the Brahmo Samaj exposed deep divides. In Maharashtra, there was a fierce battle between Gokhale and Tilak for control of the Pune Sarvajanik Sabha. Across the country, factionalism stirred discontent, and the deepening sense of frustration provided fertile ground for extremism. Yet, factionalism alone cannot explain the rise of extremism. The failure of moderate politics was the primary catalyst. Congress, under moderate leadership, was governed by an undemocratic constitution, and despite efforts by Tilak to introduce reforms, the constitution remained unchanged. The Congress was financially struggling, with neither the support of capitalists nor the patronage of the princely states sufficient to sustain it. The social reforms advocated by the moderates, inspired by Western liberal ideals, often clashed with popular sentiment, especially when they proposed reforms that challenged local traditions. The moderates were also seen as ineffective in securing any substantial political gains, their demands for reforms largely unfulfilled, further fueling disillusionment. The turning point came under Lord Curzon's administration, which intensified nationalist feelings. Curzon's actions, ranging from the reconstitution of the Calcutta Corporation to the introduction of the Indian Universities Act and the controversial partition of Bengal, were perceived as direct attacks on Indian interests. Rather than weakening nationalist sentiment, these actions galvanized it, especially among the extremists. The partition of Bengal in 1905, which Curzon framed as a strategy to weaken Bengali nationalists, instead sparked widespread protest and gave rise to the Swadeshi movement, a rallying cry for nationalist sentiments and a challenge to British authority. The Swadeshi movement, born from opposition to the partition of Bengal, embodied the principles of extremism. The call for Swaraj, first raised by moderate leaders, was now championed by the extremists, who took to new methods of resistance. They moved beyond the traditional methods of prayer and petitions, embracing passive resistance, the boycott of British goods, and the promotion of indigenous alternatives. This new form of agitation was rooted in the idea of self-reliance and the development of Swadeshi, indigenous, industries and education, but it was also deeply intertwined with cultural revivalism. The extremists turned to India's past for inspiration, invoking a golden age of Hindu civilization. Leaders like Tilak and Aurobindo Ghosh drew upon symbols from Indian history and mythology, celebrating figures such as Shivaji and Ranjit Singh, to inspire a sense of pride and purpose. The idea of an idealized, virile past was central to this vision, offering a contrast to the emasculated image of the colonized Indian in colonial discourse. The movement emphasized physical and spiritual strength, encouraging young men to embrace a new form of manliness, which combined the best of Western masculinity with traditional Hindu values of self-discipline and asceticism. This cultural and ideological shift was also a response to the colonial assertion that India's political incapacity was due to its effeminate, disorganized nature. The extremists sought to counter this narrative by reclaiming the ideal of a strong, self-sufficient India. Their appeal to the masses was often mediated through religious revivalism, with Hindu symbols and teachings serving as a rallying point. However, this approach alienated many non-Hindus, especially Muslims, and failed to address the needs of the lower castes, many of whom had aspirations for social mobility that the Swadeshi movement did not accommodate. Despite these challenges, the Swadeshi movement gained momentum, especially in Bengal. By 1905, the movement had expanded from protests against the partition of Bengal to a broader demand for Swaraj and a rejection of British goods. Mass mobilization took place through samitis, societies, and educational institutions, though this mobilization was often limited to the educated elite and the upper castes. Labor strikes were organized in foreign-owned industries, but the movement struggled to gain traction among the wider working class. Despite the fervor and ideological drive behind the Swadeshi movement, its success was limited. The boycott of British goods did not have a significant impact on British trade, and by 1908, the movement began to wane. The failure of mass mobilization, combined with the Surat split of 1907, when the Congress split between moderates and extremists, further weakened the movement. Revolutionary terrorism, which had become an increasingly prominent part of extremist politics, also began to take hold, but this too faced severe repression from the British government. The rise of extremism and the Swadeshi movement marked a pivotal chapter in India's struggle for independence. It represented a shift in political strategy from petitioning and negotiation to active resistance and cultural revival. Though the movement ultimately did not achieve its immediate goals, it laid the groundwork for future nationalist efforts and set the stage for the more radical phases of India's fight for independence.